Hi. It's been a tough year for all of us this year, 2020. And in this next podcast, I've actually introduced you to a friend of mine by the name of Mr. Peter Vinkenfleugel. Peter is an interesting individual and he's had an interesting life. Peter has been willing to produce this podcast with me and to sort of explain what his outlook is on 2021. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of Peter's comments or thoughts. I think there's an awful lot of hope and opportunities out in the New Zealand market, but I also think that it is highly valuable for us to get another person's perspective. And Peter has given to us his perspective from knowledge of his understanding of the market and his world. So we go into such things as what is your balance in life, thinking laterally, talking about the necessity to include people and to pay people for what they are worth and their value. We talk about the necessity of cutting costs within business. So let's go over and I introduce you to Mr. Peter Vinkenfleugel. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoy the podcast. Cheers. Bye-bye. It's John Barley from Ritetrack New Zealand Limited, and we're here with Mr. Peter Vinkenfleugel, and I've known Peter now for 15 years. And Peter is a Dutch immigrant. He came out here with his family, and then he went to Auckland Institute of Technology to do a certificate in chemistry for his future career in industry. He then went on in the 1970s and worked for a company called Nilex and was introduced to the corporate world. In the 1980s, he started with working in the life insurance industry, which lasted for about a year, and he found it rather challenging, to say the least, because the industry is challenging. He got involved with two Think Big projects in Taranaki. In 1987, he was employed by ICI and then promoted, being able to travel to Chicago and then back to Sydney. He then worked for a New Zealand company for a year. He became self-employed, owning and developing his own products for the garden industry. The business was called Ceramic Pots. He sold the business in 2003, and he went on into the property maintenance. Now he is sort of self-employed and semi-retired, but he's always looking for his opportunities. I asked Peter what his ultimate aim was in life, and that was that he just wanted to take whatever opportunities were there in front of him, and if it felt good, he would take it. He believes life is pretty awesome. But the subject today is, are we on the right track to survive the new abnormal? I personally find this question rather challenging, in that I don't think there is an abnormal. I think we've gone back to the normal, and people find it comfortable to be with the normal. Even though they were uncomfortable, they feel comfortable with the uncomfortable. So is there really a new abnormal? So let's hear Peter's point of view on that. Peter, welcome.
Thanks, John. Good to be here.
Pleasure.
My first podcast, so
Yeah.
Another one to tick off.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, COVID, the new abnormal. I guess the way I look at it is we have to expect that things are going to be different, and if they're not, great. But what we had in the past and the way we lived our lives, especially in the Western world, Western culture, as I think we all know, was far from perfect. Money has become more and more important to everyone because of lack of it, rather than an abundance of it. and we found ourselves, instead of having to work one job like Dad did, and Mum at home looking after the kids, well, that's not normal anymore, that's abnormal. When I grew up, back in the 60s and 70s, Mum was always at home. Dad worked 5.5, 6 days a week as a builder. And he brought up us 5 kids in the private education system, built a batch near the beach in Wangapara, and life was insanely good. Mum was always there when we needed it, but now she's got to pay $200 or $300 a week to look after her kids and then find a job to pay for it. Does that make sense? Well, not to me, John.
So where do you see the abnormal in these times of COVID-19? Or another way of putting it, what's the new normal?
The new normal is disruption, chaos, in my opinion. I could be wrong, I often am, but that's the way I see it. I think 2021 will be, to put it nicely, a very challenging year, where people start to run out of money. I can see interest rates starting to move up, and 1%, with the amount of money borrowed out there, is going to be massively hurting a lot of good people, businesses and families.
So what advice or guidance would you give to young people or people that are still in the workforce today with this new, what you call the new normal?
I guess 3 thoughts. Hang in there, nothing's forever. Hang on to your cash while you got it, because it's going to be more and more valuable as time marches on. Cash is going to be king, because a lot of people are going to be selling assets they don't want to sell, but they are forced to sell by our banks and others. And thirdly, don't ever give up.
Okay, Peter, I would put to you that, as I said before, that there is no new normal. In fact, what we've done is we've gone back to the old normal.
Correct.
So why do we talk about the new normal if all we're doing is just going back to what we already had?
I think there's a percentage of people that during the lockdowns of March, April, and even extending into May in New Zealand, people's eyes were open to the fact that, well, there is another way of living. They were forced to be with their families because they couldn't go anywhere else, and they either got on or they didn't, but most of them, I think, hopefully got on. And they thought, wow, this isn't all bad. Why can't we do this all the time where we get paid not to work? Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I'm at home with the people I love. But memories are short. And now things return to normal for the time being, and that's what I'm saying. Big qualification for the time being. We consider ourselves to be back to normal. And to a certain extent we are. But look at our rugby team, the All Blacks. Their normal season is May to November. Well, this season they started in September and finished in December. How normal is that?
Okay. For business owners, Peter, what do you think business owners should be looking at in the next 12 months or next 24 months, considering that we are now going back to where we feel comfortable and there is no really new normal? What would you advise or give to business owners?
Well, I'm no economist, but I have run a number of businesses, most of them successful, and ones that fell over through no fault of my own, through illness or whatever. Number one, as I said before, no matter whether you're in business or as a private individual, as a family, cash will be king, in my opinion, in the coming years. Even though the banks would like to wipe it, and if we let them, they will. If we stay united, they will have no choice but to leave it as a viable commodity and coinage. The thing we need to do as business people, though, get our costs down, think outside the square. Do you really need to operate out of leased premises and feed that rich landlord? Or is there another way? I mean, right now, I've gone from a very comfortable office in a beautiful area of North Auckland, paying stupid money, to actually operating out of a rundown cabin. You know, with communication the way it is, I've got my cost down by 3/4. That cabin didn't quite work out because the landlord was not what he pretended to be. I won't go into it, but it starts with A and ends in E. And I've moved on back to my bus that I've been living in for the last 11 years, and where I started my business, Reignite New Zealand, back in March during COVID. I started it there, I outgrew it, and now I will find a way of making it work again in my bus that cost me nothing.
Okay. Peter, I disagree with you because I don't think the way through is actually reducing costs. And the reason I say that is because usually the costs that you incur are from necessary suppliers to make your business operate and be functional. So if you can't reduce your costs, what other options do you think business owners should use in this new normal?
Okay, costs are one thing, and you can only control the costs that you can control. There are certainly ones that you can't control, but you can always negotiate. When vendors and suppliers are desperate for business, for cash, to move their stock so they can turn it over, they will negotiate. And I guess my other point is, that's just the first step to surviving the new abnormal. The second one is to look at your staff and incentivize them, rather than just pay them a wage or contract them. Incentivize them to do a better job. There's a classic example where New Zealand Media Enterprises, I think it is, NZME, nearly went belly up last year. Now, they run about a third to a half of all New Zealand media, radio stations, papers, etc. in New Zealand. And they're not perfect. They print some really dumb stuff, especially out of the Washington Post. And it was bought for a peppercorn price by a lady who decided, well, we've got good staff, but they can do better. Oh, we'll incentivize them to do better by offering them what they are worth. Their input will be reflective in their remuneration package. And guess what? A year later, 18 months later, they are humming.
So, Peter, what do you think is wrong with the New Zealand business mind at the moment?
To be brutally honest, they're not thinking apart from what's happening today, not thinking into the future and what could be or not be. They don't dare to dream what could be. I mean, that's just too hard. If they're comfortable, they'll keep their boat and their badge and their Audi or their Beamer, and life will carry on as normal. But they could be wrong. And if they are, man, they're in trouble, because their overheads and their outgoings through payments for all their assets and toys are going to catch up with them through the banks or the financial institution that they owe to. So get rid of your debt as much as you can.
So, listening to what you're saying, you're coming at it from a pretty negative perspective and saying it's all doom and gloom out there.
No, not at all. I'm not saying doom and gloom. In fact, I think New Zealand is probably a better place than just about anywhere in the world, because we're small, we're nimble. We only have two governing bodies. One's a local one, a council, and the national body is our government. So we don't have to worry about 52 states, or in the case of Australia, 6 or 7 territories and states. We are nimble, so we can change quickly if we want to, and we're united. And I cannot agree with you that I'm negative. I'm realistic. There's a big difference. I'm thinking, what if it turns to custard? I'm not saying it will, but I'm saying what if.
But the answer to the what if is actually being responsive and coming up with some solutions to the what if.
Correct.
What would be your solutions other than just cutting costs?
Cutting costs, incentivising staff, we've been through that. And thirdly, think outside the square about what your business is about. If you're employing people that aren't passionate about what you do, don't share your vision, then what are they doing there? They've got a job. When you're passionate about a job, it's not a job. It's just, you've got to have that sense of achievement, and if you're not passionate, you'll never find it. So you've got to be ruthless and cut out the people that are using you for an income and not contributing to the overall benefit of the collective.
So how would you incentivize the people?
Pay them what they're worth. Pay them what their contribution is. Forget about their qualifications. I don't give a stuff. I mean, millionaires have come through the system somehow without any qualifications, even from school, let alone university. So that whole system is BS as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, so there's many businesses out there that are really suffering financially, and they are now looking at increasing the minimum wage to $20 an hour, plus they're also been told to allow for 10 sick days per annum per employee. Plus there's also compliance. Do you think that there's room to start thinking about incentivizing their people when there are all these compliance issues hanging over business owners' heads? And why do you think it's necessary?
I think the people we need to incentivize are the politicians to butt out of our lives and let us run our own lives and our own businesses. That's my honest opinion. How dare they? How dare they tell us what to do?
Okay, but if I said to you that when things don't work well in business or in the business economy, the first thing business owners do, and there are a number of them in LinkedIn, they point the finger and say it's the government's fault. It's not the government's fault.
No.
So whose fault is it?
Well, where do you cheat it? Back to the managing director, the owner of the business. He is accountable for the way the business runs. If he makes the wrong call, he'll have to wear it.
So what do you think business owners should do to change their mindset?
It's not rocket science, John. Think outside the square.
That is a very common phrase, think outside the square, and there's also the thing about being lateral thinking, but it's also the ability for business owners to have the room to think outside the square. But when you have an awful lot of pressures placed upon you in the current normal, they can't think outside the square.
100% correct.
Okay, so how do you change it?
It's not going to happen through any one person. It's about taking people outside, the people in decision-making positions outside, away from all the stress, all the distractions, all the stuff they're trying to deal with and are hardly coping with. Take them to a retreat for a day, a week, whatever it takes. And say, hey, have you forgotten how to breathe? Have you forgotten that grass is green? That nature's out there, that birds chirp? That's a bloody good start. It's not the total answer, John, but that grounding in nature, to me anyway, is huge.
Okay.
And if I can't do it every day, man, I'm not the same performer.
Okay, I'll put this to you, that a number of business owners they're over been going to resorts. they find them very costly.
I said retreats. I said retreats.
Retreats,
Big
resorts,
difference.
whatever.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it still costs money. And also from my own personal experience, when you go to a retreat and you go through these various courses, the level of information that you gain during that period of time to a point is rather overwhelming, but you only actually ever retain about 5% of the total package.
Yep.
So is going to a retreat the answer and the only answer? And what would the other options be to a business owner to sit down and smell the air and look at the color of grass and birds, etc.?
I'll tell you just a very brief story that changed my life forever. About 10 years ago, I nearly died from white-tailed spider bites. And I was in my naturopath's office because I couldn't take antibiotics anymore. I was immune and allergic to them. And I was in a real mess physically. Mentally, I managed to hold it together. And in their office, in this naturopath's office, was a brochure. And it was headed the Mankind Project. I didn't know anything about it, never heard of it. And I took the brochure home and finally found it again a few days later and read it and thought, wow, a 3-day retreat where it's only men and the instructors are 1-to-1. And they can only take 50 men and they only do it once or twice a year in New Zealand and elsewhere around the world. And it's all about finding out who you are, identifying yourself as a man. So there's no women involved. Women have their own go-tos. I've got no idea what they are because I'm not one, believe it or not. So you arrive in a remote location in the middle of the North Island in the middle of winter, cold as like 2 degrees, and you're told to be there at 8 o'clock and bring nothing but what they specify. No cigarettes, no alcohol. It's like an SAS camp almost. We arrived about 10 minutes early. We were turned away and said, you were told to come at 8 o'clock, it's 10 to 8, piss off. Come back at 8 o'clock. And that's how it started. And then before we got out of the car, when we arrived back at 8, a gruff voice appeared out of the darkness. What are you doing here? And went on and on. And the whole weekend was like, all of a sudden you're up at 2 o'clock in the morning, get out of bed now, strip off naked. Right. See that frosty grass over there? You're going to walk it for 5 minutes in chains. All 50 of us. And then it was 48, and then it was 42. And by the end, there's about 40 of us that left. And we had been through, well, torture's not too big a word. But man, you came out of there thinking, how to be a man is not bad after all, because I survived something I never knew I could do. Now, shedding that back to the environment that we find ourselves in the corporate world and small businesses, if you're tough enough, you can achieve anything.
Are you saying then that business owners are not tough enough?
Most of them are patsies, never experienced hardship in their life, especially in Auckland. Why do they think they call them Jaffas?
Do you think that that's an appropriate thing to put out there?
What do you mean, appropriate thing?
Well, considering that there are going to be business people listening to this, do you think that hearing that they might find it a little bit insulting?
Oh, some of them will find it totally offensive, and they'll want my address and send the mafia around to shoot me. I don't care. A lot of people will not accept the truth because it's not what they want to hear, because they're in denial.
Okay. I think the challenge is for business owners to recognize that they've got a challenge in front of them, and also they need to recognize that they need to have a culture change within the business. How they go about having that culture change and what they do to make that culture change work is entirely dependent upon the business owner's own character.
Yep.
but to say that they are patsies would to many be considered as
Offensive.
highly offensive, because many of the business owners are totally overwhelmed, and they don't have room to actually be creative or to think of solutions outside of the box.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe this opinion that you have is clouded by the fact that their environment is a lot different to your own.
I've been in that environment, John. I've experienced it. There's a word called balance, and not many of us have it anymore because of the demands placed on us by, I call it the machine, the system, the bureaucrats, the governments, you name it, they're all into it. I'm out of it, and I've had enough of it, and thankfully I've got the balance in life now that it's taken me a good 40 years to achieve. So I work hard. Trust me, I work very hard. Some nights I don't even sleep. But I'm full of adrenaline from my latest health trauma, and that's good because I can work 22 hours a day for a week.
Okay.
Now let me finish. So there's the word balance, and not many of us have achieved that, especially in corporate life, because of the demands, and that's understandable. But if you take a step back and say, right, that'll have to wait, and that'll have to wait, and I can delegate this to this person because I trust them, keyword trust, and you have to be very selective, and people have to walk their talk in order for you to delegate and walk away thinking, at least that job is ticked off.
Okay. Balance is very important in people's lives,
Mm-hmm.
and people are struggling to find that balance. But to actually recognize that they need to find that balance is a very long journey. And for you to suddenly turn around and say people need to find their balance to sort themselves out is not necessarily fair or reasonable.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Okay, so the other thing is that from your perspective, you have you're in a very beneficial situation because you don't have the responsibilities and the weight put upon you as many of business owners do, i.e. bank loans, compliancy, marketing, sales, accountants costs, and also being continually hounded by good meaning mentors and coaches. So is it fair for you to say these things that you just said?
I'm only talking my truth. That's all I can do. And for you to say that I'm out of the system, I'm not. Far from it. In March, I formed a company called Reignite New Zealand Limited. It's all legal. It's ready to rock, ready to fire. The only thing missing is two things. People I can trust. People that are passionate about New Zealand and getting the thing bloody sorted in terms of labelling our product again or branding it after the national government killed it 9 years ago when they signed the FTA with China. And I've got two other ventures under that as well, and a few others which I won't even mention. The other two important to me are what I'm calling a sub-company called Dignity for the Disabled, where people, through no fault of their own, find themselves in dire straits and absolute holes in terms of living in. The government's doing its best, but spending 38 million is the last time I heard, every quarter, housing homeless people. Now, a lot of those people don't choose to live like that. They would love to work, but through circumstances outside their control, they find themselves destitute and in poverty, and the government does not have the big enough printing machine to cover their costs. So they shove them in a hotel or a motel, pay stupid money for the privilege of living in a dog box. So I've got a way of sorting that out, but unfortunately the government can't help us with that because it's not part of their policy.
Okay.
Secondly, the other project is helping disaffected youths that are Youth on Track, which I tried to launch 7 years ago, and it fell apart because we couldn't register in time for us to kick it off. It took 3 months for the charitable trust to give us official registration, and in the meantime everyone's circumstances changed in terms of trustees, and I got a bit crook and it fell over. But now it's time, especially after COVID, with so many kids being affected adversely by the situation outside their control, in fact outside everyone's control, apart from the health department. So that is very close to kicking off too. I'm looking for premises now and finance, and it will happen next year for the second time, and this time with the lessons learned we'll make it. So I'm not retired, not even semi-retired, and I am in the corporate world because I'm applying for money and kicking ass where it needs to be kicked, and I will get there. I don't know how, but I will.
All right. Peter, thank you for your time and your thoughts on what's abnormal in this new life that we've got after post-COVID-19. And I trust that you enjoy being able to express your views. And so thank you for your time.
Thank you for taking the time, and let's do a few more of them. If people like what they hear, if they don't, well, it's their choice, but I can only say what I believe, and not all of it will happen, I'm sure. I'll be wrong, man. That's where you learn from your mistakes. Thanks, John.
Cool, thank you. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, and we'll catch you again soon. Thanks, bye-bye.